Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 125, Meno 90a to C. We're two-thirds of the way through the dialogue, and Anytus has just joined the conversation. Well, he hasn't said anything yet, he's just sat down. Socrates is explaining to Meno why it is worth discussing the problem of virtue and the teaching of virtue with Anytus. So far, he has just concentrated on Anytus's father. It turns out that Anytus's father, Anthemion, is a self-made man, and Socrates goes to great length to point out that Anthemion is not a corrupt politician, as is Ismenias the Theban. And I didn't say last time, but it appears that Ismenias supported democrats exiled from Athens, such as Anytus, and he may have helped them regain power in Athens. We don't know from Socrates' comment whether he thinks that Anytus himself is corrupt, but he's definitely associating him with Ismenias. I say definitely because this is a dialogue and Plato doesn't mention people just by chance. Now let's see what else Socrates says about Anthemion, the father of Anytus. Epeita kai ta'alla huperefanos tokon enai polites ude oncodes te kai epachtes ala kosmios kai eustales aner. Then, for the rest, appearing to be not an arrogant citizen, nor puffed up and offensive, but an orderly and decent man. Epeta tuton eu ethrepsen kai epaidiusen hostoke athenaion to plethe. Then he brought up and educated well this person, Anytus, as seems to the majority of Athenians. Socrates is not quite saying that Anytus himself is well brought up and educated, but that the majority of Athenians think that his father brought Anytus up well and educated him well. Hairuntai gun auton epitas megistas archas. At any rate, they elect him to the greatest offices. Anytus is one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, we might say, and Socrates has used the democratic opinion of the many to damn him with faint praise. Socrates himself hasn't said anything about Anytus himself, what Socrates himself thinks of Anytus. Most of his description stems from Anytus's father and what the Democrats, the majority of the Athenians, think about his father and the fact that they elect Anytus to high office. We might conclude from what Socrates says that Anytus is a typical corrupt politician who's prepared to bribe in order to gain office, and he is a not particularly pleasant person. Meno probably wouldn't have caught any of the hints, and he would assume that Socrates has been praising Anytus. At any rate, Socrates proceeds as if he has just shown that it is worth discussing the subject with Anytus. Dikai onde metato iuton ze tenaretes peri didascalus, et esin et me kai hoitenes. It's right, then, to search with such people for teachers about virtue, whether there are or are not, and who. If we recall, this had been the last question Meno had asked. He asked Socrates if he thought that there weren't any teachers of virtue. So here we are. Socrates is now going to ask Anytus to help find teachers of virtue. Suun heimin o anute, sudze teson, moitikaitos autuxeno menoni tode, peritutu pragmatos, tines an eien didaskaloi. You then, Anytus, search with us, with me, and this here, Meno, your xenos, about this matter, who would be teachers. We might imagine that Socrates will now brainstorm with Meno and Anytus, but actually when he talks about searching with him and Meno, he's just going to talk with Anytus, and Meno can sit back and enjoy himself. This isn't the first time that Socrates has allowed Meno to sit back and listen. He's already had an exercise with the slave, or one of the slaves of Meno, and we may imagine that the following conversation will be a bit like the conversation he had with that slave. Obviously, there will be some differences. For example, the conversation with the slave concerned a geometrical problem, while here they are simply looking for teachers of virtue. Instead of asking on what line a square is to be produced, we may imagine that Socrates could ask, which sort of teachers should we be looking for? And they might identify various types of teachers. We might also then suspect that just as Socrates deliberately misled the slave to give the wrong answers, he might deliberately mislead Anytus to give the wrong answers. As we saw with the slave, finding the wrong answers on the way to finding the right answer was an essential step in attempting to understand the answer and not merely have an answer. It's interesting that Socrates doesn't begin with the question we might expect someone to ask a new interlocutor: who do you think are teachers of virtue? Instead of that, Socrates begins one of his typical inductive interrogations, where he collects a few examples, and then from that he expects a conclusion. Hodede skepsai, e buloimethe menone tonde agathon iatron genestai, paratinas an auton pempoimen didascalus, auru paratus iatrus? Panuge. Examine it this way. If we were to want this Meno to become a good doctor, to which teachers would we send him? Wouldn't we send him to the doctors? Absolutely. Before we talk about the inductive argument, we should note that Socrates has implied that Meno is looking for a teacher of virtue in order to become someone with virtue, in order to become a good person. This is not something Meno had suggested. Now let's guess where the inductive argument is going. If a good doctor will be taught by doctors, we can imagine that a good architect will be taught by architects, and that would mean that a good person, a person with virtue, will be taught by people. I've come to that conclusion because the good doctor here is taught not by good doctors, but only by doctors. The goodness is in the student rather than in the teachers. This may be a simple mistake, but we'll see what happens. Did scutotomon agathon pu loimethagenesthai aru paratus scutotomus? Nay. What then? If we were to want Meno to become a good leather cutter, wouldn't we send him to the leather cutters? Yes. The pattern is identical to the previous question, and therefore some words are left out in Greek. For example, the word Meno. One word that has not been omitted is good, and it is still applied to the student rather than to the potential teachers. We mentioned last time that Anytus's father, who was said to have become rich, would probably have become rich through tanning, because we have scholia referring to Anytus as rich from, and then we have two different words from two different scholia on the name of the techne. The techne can be either burso de psyche, which means tanning, or scuto de psyche, which is also tanning, or literally dressing leather. Scutos is skin or hide or leather. Therefore, when Socrates refers here to the scutotomos, the leather cutter, he may be attempting to get Anytus to realize from his own profession that what he is asking is wrong. A good leather worker will be the teacher, not the student. Asking whether Meno would become a good leather cutter by being sent to leather cutters in general is ridiculous. Anytus should know this from his own experience. This is why I think that after the example with the doctor, Socrates then chose the leather cutter. And yet Anytus sees no problem and just says, yes. Socrates doesn't press the point and simply generalizes. Kaitala hutos panuge. And the others in this way? Absolutely. If Socrates used the same pattern now for looking for teachers of virtue, he would have to ask, and to make Meno a good person of virtue, would we send him to the people with virtue? And Anytus would say yes, but we would be no nearer the answer than at the beginning, because obviously we need teachers of virtue. So what is Socrates playing at? Well, we'll see next time that he doesn't ask that question.